Historical negationism or denialism is an illegitimate distortion of the historical record. It is often imprecisely referred to as historical revisionism, but that term also denotes a legitimate academic pursuit of reinterpretation of the historical record and questioning the accepted views. In attempting to revise the past, illegitimate historical revisionism may use techniques inadmissible in proper historical discourse, such as presenting known forged documents as genuine, inventing ingenious but implausible reasons for distrusting genuine documents, attributing conclusions to books and sources that report the opposite, manipulating statistical series to support the given point of view, and deliberately mistranslating texts, in languages other than the revisionists. Some countries, such as Germany, have criminalized the negationist revision of certain historical events, while others take a more cautious position for various reasons, such as protection of free speech. Still others mandate negationist views. Notable examples of negationism include Holocaust denial, Armenian genocide denial and Japanese war crime denial. In literature, the consequences of historical revisionism have been imaginatively depicted in some works of fiction, such as 1984, by George Orwell. In modern times, negationism may spread via new media, such as the Internet. Origin of the term. The term negationism, was first coined by the French historian Henri Rousseau in his 1987 book The Vichy Syndrome, which looked at the French popular memory of Vichy France and the French resistance. Rousseau argued that it was necessary to distinguish between legitimate historical revisionism in Holocaust studies and politically motivated denial of the Holocaust, which he termed negationism. Purposes. Usually, the purpose of historical negation is to achieve a national, political aim, by transferring war guilt, demonizing an enemy, providing an illusion of victory, or preserving a friendship. Sometimes the purpose of a revised history is to sell more books or to attract attention with a newspaper headline. The historian James M. McPherson said that negationists would want revisionist history understood as a consciously falsified or distorted interpretation of the past to serve partisan or ideological purposes in the present. Ideological influence. The principal functions of negationist history are the abilities to control ideological influence and to control political influence. In History Men Battle Over Britain's Future, Michael D. Ancona said that historical negationists seem to have been given a collective task in nations' cultural development, the full significance of which is emerging only now, to redefine status in a changing world. History is a social resource that contributes to shaping national identity, culture, and the public memory. Through the study of history, people are imbued with a particular cultural identity, therefore, by negatively revising history, the negationist can craft a specific, ideological identity. Because historians are credited as people who single-mindedly pursue truth, by way of fact, negationist historians capitalize on the historian's professional credibility, and present their pseudo-history as true scholarship. By adding a measure of credibility to the work of revised history, the ideas of the negationist historian are more readily accepted in the public mind. As such, professional historians recognize the revisionist practice of historical negationism as the work of truth seekers finding different truths in the historical record to fit their political, social, and ideological contexts. Political influence. History provides insight into past political policies and consequences, and thus assists people in extrapolating political implications for contemporary society. Historical negationism is applied to cultivate a specific political myth, sometimes with official consent from the government, whereby self-taught, amateur, and dissident academic historians either manipulate or misrepresent historical accounts to achieve political ends. In the USSR, 1917–91, the ideology of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and Soviet historiography treated reality and the party line as the same intellectual entity, Soviet historical negationism advanced a specific, political, and ideological agenda about Russia and her place in world history. Techniques of negationism. Historical negationism applies the techniques of research, quotation, and presentation for deception of the reader and denial of the historical record. In support of the revised history perspective, the negationist historian uses false documents as genuine sources, presents specious reasons to distrust genuine documents, exploits published opinions, by quoting out of historical context, manipulates statistics, and mistranslates texts in other languages. The revision techniques of historical negationism operate in the intellectual space of public debate for the advancement of a given interpretation of history and the cultural perspective of the revised history. As a document, the revised history is used to negate the validity of the factual, documentary record, and so reframe explanations and perceptions of the discussed historical event, in order to deceive the reader, the listener, and the viewer. Therefore, historical negationism functions as a technique of propaganda. Rather than submit their works for peer review, negationist historians rewrite history and use logical fallacies to construct arguments that will obtain the desired results, a revised history that supports an agenda political, ideological, religious, etc. In the practice of historiography, the British historian Richard J. Evans describes the technical differences between professional historians and negationist historians. Reputable and professional historians do not suppress parts of quotations from documents that go against their own case, but take them into account, and, if necessary, amend their own case, accordingly. They do not present, as genuine, documents which they know to be forged, just because these forgeries happen to back up what they are saying. They do not invent ingenious, but implausible and utterly unsupported reasons for distrusting genuine documents, because these documents run counter to their arguments. Again, they amend their arguments, if this is the case, or, indeed, abandon them altogether. They do not consciously attribute their own conclusions to books and other sources, which, in fact, on closer inspection, actually say the opposite. They do not eagerly seek out the highest possible figures in a series of statistics, independently of their reliability, or otherwise, simply because they want, for whatever reason, to maximize the figure in question, but rather, they assess all the available figures, as impartially as possible, in order to arrive at a number that will withstand the critical scrutiny of others. They do not knowingly mistranslate sources in foreign languages in order to make them more serviceable to themselves. They do not willfully invent words, phrases, quotations, incidents, and events, for which there is no historical evidence, in order to make their arguments more plausible. Deception. Deception includes falsifying information, obscuring the truth, and lying in order to manipulate public opinion about the historical event discussed in the revised history. The negationist historian applies the techniques of deception to achieve either a political or an ideological goal, or both. The field of history distinguishes among history books based upon credible, verifiable sources, and were peer-reviewed before publication, and deceptive history books, based upon incredible sources, and which were not submitted for peer review. The distinction among types of history book rests upon the research techniques used in writing a history. Verifiability, accuracy, and openness to criticism are central tenets of historical scholarship. When these techniques are sidestepped, the presented historical information might be deliberately deceptive. A revised history. Denial. Denial is defensively protecting information from being shared with other historians, and claiming that facts are untrue, especially denial of the war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated in the course of the World War II, 1939–45, and the Holocaust, 1933–45. The negationist historian protects the historical revisionism project by shifting the blame, censorship, distraction, and media manipulation, occasionally, denial by protection includes risk management for the physical security of revisionist sources. Relativization and trivialization. Comparing certain historical atrocities to other crimes is the practice of relativization, interpretation by moral judgments, in order to alter public perception of the first historical atrocity. Although such comparisons can often occur in negationist history, their pronouncement is not usually part of revisionist intentions upon the historical facts, but an opinion of moral judgment. The Holocaust and Nazism. The historian Deborah Lipstadt said that the concept of comparable Allied wrongs, such as the expulsion of Germans after World War II from Nazi-colonized lands and the formal Allied war crimes, is at the center of, and is a continually repeated theme of, contemporary Holocaust denial, that such relativization presents immoral equivalencies. Examples: book burning. Repositories of literature have been targeted throughout history, e.g., the Library of Alexandria, burning of the liturgical and historical books of the St. Thomas Christians by the Archbishop of Goa Alexodomanes, including recently, such as the burning of Jaffna Library and the destruction of Iraqi libraries by ISIS during the fall of Mosul. Chinese book burning. The burning of books and burying of scholars, traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, pinyin, fnshkngr, literally, burning of books and burying, alive, of, Confucian, scholars, or fires of Qin, is the purported burning of writings and slaughter of scholars during the Qin dynasty of ancient China, between the period of 213 and 210 BC. Books at this point refers to writings on bamboo strips, which were then bound together. This contributed to the loss to history of many philosophical theories of proper government, known as the 100 Schools of Thought. The official philosophy of government, legalism, survived. Nazi book burning. In the mid-1930s, the Nazi book burnings were part of a campaign of anti-intellectualism conducted throughout Germany and Austria by the Deutsche Studentenschaft, German Student Association, of the Third Reich, 1933–45. The burning of books was a public ceremony in which the works of authors whose politics were classical liberal, anarchist, socialist, pacifist, and communist were fuel for bonfires. Given the official anti-Semitism of the Reich, the works of Jewish writers were specifically identified for burning, thus did Nazi Germany rid themselves of writers deemed subversive of the National Socialist ideology. In Poland, the Sonderfahndungsbuch Poland, Special Prosecution Book Poland, was the book of political proscription for the killing of socially important Poles who might lead resistance against the Nazi occupation of Poland, 1939–45. Compiled before the war began in 1939, the book contained lists that identified more than 61,000 members of the Polish elites, political and social activists, the intelligentsia, scholars, actors, former military officers as enemies of the state dangerous to the Third Reich. In Germany-occupied France, anti-fascist exiles made a library of burned books of every book that Adolf Hitler had ordered destroyed in France. It listed copies of titles that had been burned. The book burnings in France were an idea that the French fascists, of the collaborating Vichy government, 1940–44, borrowed from the Nazis, to cleanse French culture of Jewish intellectualism and the foreign politics of pacifism, decadent literature, and degenerate art, as the Nazis had cleansed German culture. In the event, after the final solution had concluded, for the post-war world, the Nazis had planned to establish a museum of Judaism that would have featured selected books of Jewish culture, preserved in memoriam of the extinct Jews of Europe. United States history. Confederate revisionism. The historical negationism of American Civil War revisionists and neo-Confederates claims that the Confederate States, 1861–65, were the defenders rather than the instigators of the war, and that the Confederacy's motivation for secession from the United States was the maintenance of the Southern states' rights and limited government, rather than the preservation and expansion of the chattel slavery of African Americans. Regarding neo-Confederate revisionism of the U.S. Civil War, the historian Brooks D. Simpson said that this is an active attempt to reshape historical memory, an effort by white Southerners to find historical justifications for present-day actions. The neo-Confederate movement's ideologues have grasped that if they control how people remember the past, they'll control how people approach the present and the future. Ultimately, this is a very conscious war for memory and heritage. It's a quest for legitimacy, the eternal quest for justification. In the early 20th century, Mildred Rutherford, the historian general of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, UDC, led the attack against American history textbooks that did not present the lost cause of the Confederacy, ca. 1900, version of the history of the U.S. Civil War. To that pedagogical end, Rutherford assembled a massive collection of documents that included essay contests on the glory of the Ku Klux Klan and personal tributes to faithful slaves. About the historical negationism of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the historian David Blight said, "All UDC members and leaders were not as virulently racist as Rutherford, but all, in the name of a reconciled nation, participated in an enterprise that deeply influenced the white supremacist vision of Civil War memory." War crimes. Japanese war crimes. The post-war minimization of the war crimes of Japanese imperialism is an example of illegitimate historical revisionism. Some contemporary Japanese revisionists, such as Yuko Iwanami, granddaughter of General Hideki Tojo, propose that Japan's invasion of China, and World War II, itself, were justified reactions to racist Western imperialism of the time. On March 2, 2007, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe denied that the military had forced women into sexual slavery during the war, saying, "The fact is, there is no evidence to prove there was coercion." Before he spoke, some Liberal Democratic Party legislators also sought to revise Yohei Kono's apology to former comfort women in 1993. Likewise, there was the controversial negation of the 6-week Nanking Massacre in 1937–1938. Shinzo Abe led the Japanese Society for History textbook reform and headed the Diet Antenna of Nippon Kaigi, two openly revisionist groups denying Japanese war crimes. Editor-in-chief of the conservative Yomiuri Shimbun Sunio Watanabe criticized the Yasukuni Shrine as a bastion of revisionism. The Yasukuni Shrine runs a museum where they show items in order to encourage and worship militarism. It's wrong for the Prime Minister to visit such a place. Other critics note that men, who would contemporarily be perceived as Korean and Chinese, are enshrined for the military actions they effected as Japanese imperial subjects. Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. The Hibakusha, explosion-affected people, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki seek compensation from their government and criticize it for failing to accept responsibility for having instigated and then prolonged an aggressive war long after Japan's defeat was apparent, resulting in a heavy toll in Japanese, Asian and American lives. Historians Hill and Koshiro have stated that attempts to minimize the importance of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is revisionist history. E. B. Sledge expressed concern that such revisionism, in his words mellowing, would allow us to forget the harsh facts of the history that led to the bombings. Serbian war crimes in the Yugoslav wars. There have been a number of scholars and political activists who have publicly disagreed with mainstream views of Serbian war crimes in the Yugoslav wars of 1991–1999. Among the points of contention are whether the victims of massacres such as the Rake Massacre and Srebrenica Massacre were unarmed civilians or armed resistance fighters, whether death and rape tolls were inflated, and whether prison camps such as Sremska Mitrovica camp were sites of mass war crimes. These scholars are labeled revisionists by their opponents. For example, Diana Johnstone's controversial book, Fool's Crusade, Yugoslavia, NATO, and Western Delusions, questions whether genocidal killings occurred in Srebrenica. The book was rejected by publishers in Sweden, prompting an open letter in 2003 defending Johnstone's book, and her right to publish, which was signed by, among others, Noam Chomsky, Arundhati Roy, Tariq Ali and John Pilger. We regard Diana Johnstone's Fool's Crusade as an outstanding work, dissenting from the mainstream view but doing so by an appeal to fact and reason, in a great tradition. On the other hand, Richard Kaplan of Reading and Oxford University reviewed the work in International Affairs, where he described the work as a revisionist and highly contentious account of Western policy and the dissolution of Yugoslavia. The historian Marko Adalahor called it an extremely poor book, one that is little more than a polemic in defense of the Serb nationalist record during the wars of the 1990s, and an ill-informed one at that. The report about Case Srebrenica by Darko Trifunovic, commissioned by the government of the Republika Srpska, was described by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia as one of the worst examples of revisionism in relation to the mass executions of Bosnian Muslims committed in Srebrenica in July 1995. Outrage and condemnation by a wide variety of Balkan and international figures eventually forced the Republika Srpska to disown the report. Turkey and the Armenian genocide. Turkish laws such as Article 301, that state a person who publicly insults Turkishness, or the Republic or Turkish Grand National Assembly of Turkey, shall be punishable by imprisonment, were used to criminally charge the writer Orhan Pamuk with disrespecting Turkey, for saying that 30,000 Kurds, and 1 million Armenians, were killed in these lands, and nobody, but me, dares to talk about it. The controversy occurred as Turkey was first vying for membership in the European Union, EU, where the suppression of dissenters is looked down upon. Article 301 originally was part of penal law reforms meant to modernize Turkey to EU standards, as part of negotiating Turkey's membership to the EU. In 2006, the charges were dropped due to pressure from the European Union and United States on the Turkish government. On February 7, 2006, 5 journalists were tried for insulting the judicial institutions of the state, and for aiming to prejudice a court case, per Article 288 of the Turkish Penal Code. The reporters were on trial for criticizing the court-ordered closing of a conference in Istanbul regarding the Armenian genocide during the time of the Ottoman Empire. The conference continued elsewhere, transferring locations from a state to a private university. The trial continued until April 11, 2006, when 4 of the reporters were acquitted. The case against the 5th journalist, Murat Belgi, proceeded until June 8, 2006, when he was also acquitted. The purpose of the conference was to critically analyze the official Turkish view of the Armenian genocide in 1915, a taboo subject in Turkey. The trial proved to be a test case between Turkey and the European Union. The EU insisted that Turkey allow increased freedom of expression rights, as a condition to membership. Soviet history. During the existence of the Russian SFSR, 1918–1991, and the Soviet Union, 1922–1991, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, attempted to ideologically and politically control the writing of both academic and popular history. These attempts were most successful in 1934–52 period. According to Menert, the Soviets' attempt to control academic historiography, the writing of history by academic historians, to promote ideological and ethno-racial imperialism by Russians. During the 1928–56 period, modern and contemporary history was generally composed according to the wishes of the CPSU, not the requirements of accepted historiographic method. According to some authors, such as Menert, this practice was fundamentally corrupt. During and after the rule of Nikita Khrushchev, 1956-64, Soviet historiographic practice is more complicated. Although not entirely corrupted, Soviet historiography was characterized by complex competition between Stalinist and anti-Stalinist Marxist historians. To avoid the professional hazard of politicized history, some historians chose pre-modern, medieval history or classical history, where ideological demands were relatively relaxed and conversation with other historians in the field could be fostered. Nevertheless, despite the potential danger of proscribed ideology corrupting historians' work, not all of Soviet historiography was corrupt. Control over party history and the legal status of individual ex-party members played a large role in dictating the ideological diversity and thus the faction in power within the CPSU. The history of the Communist Party was revised to delete references to leaders purged from the party, especially during the rule of Joseph Stalin, 1922-53. In the historiography of the Cold War, a controversy over negationist historical revisionism exists, where numerous revisionist scholars in the West have been accused of whitewashing the crimes of Stalinism, overlooking the Cencon Massacre in Poland and disregarding the validity of the Venona messages with regards to Soviet espionage in the United States. Azerbaijan. Many scholars, among them Victor Schnirelman, Willem Floor, Robert Hewson, George Bornushin, and others state that in Soviet and post-Soviet Azerbaijan since the 1960s there is a practice of revising primary sources on the South Caucasus in which any mention about Armenians is deleted. For instance, in the revised texts the word Armenian is either simply removed or is replaced by the word Albanian. There are many other examples of such falsifications, all of which have the purpose of creating an impression that historically Armenians were not present in this territory. Willem M. Floor and Hassan Javadi in the English edition of The Heavenly Rose Garden, A History of Shirvan and Dagestan by Bakakhanov specifically point out to the instances of distortions and falsifications made by Bunyatov in his Russian translation of this book. According to Bornushin and Hewson, these distortions are widespread in these works. They thus advise the readers in general to avoid the books produced in Azerbaijan in Soviet and post-Soviet times if these books do not contain the facsimile copy of original sources. Schnirelman thinks that this practice is being realized in Azerbaijan according to state order. Philip L. Cole brings an example of a theory advanced by Azerbaijani archaeologist Akhundov about Albanian origin of Kokkars as an example of patently false cultural origin myths. In their turn, Azerbaijani historians claim that the historians of other countries falsify the true history of Azerbaijan. As an example of falsifications, Azerbaijani historians consider historical references about the presence of Armenians on the territory of Karabakh. Azerbaijanis claim that Armenians appeared there only in 1828, or the fact that in these books there is no mention of the powerful states of Azerbaijan with 5,000 years of statehood history. After the director of the Hermitage Museum Mikhail Piotrowski expressed his protest about the destruction of Armenian Kokkars in Julfa, he was accused by Azeris of supporting the total falsification of the history and culture of Azerbaijan. In Azerbaijan, the Armenian genocide is officially denied and is considered a hoax. According to state ideology of Azerbaijan, a genocide of Azerbaijanis, carried out by Armenians and Russians, took place starting from 1813. North Korea. The Korean War. Since the start of the Korean War, 1950-53, the government of North Korea has consistently denied that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, launched the attack with which began the war for the communist unification of Korea. The historiography of the DPRK maintains that the war was provoked by South Korea, at the instigation of the United States. On June 17, Juche 39, the then U.S. President Truman sent Dulles as his special envoy to South Korea to examine the anti-North War scenario and give an order to start the attack. On June 18, Dulles inspected the 38th parallel and the war preparations of the ROK Army units. That day he told Syngman Rhee to start the attack on North Korea with the counter-propaganda that North Korea first invaded the South. Further North Korean pronouncements included the claim that the US needed the peninsula of Korea as a bridgehead for invading the Asian continent, and as a strategic base from which to fight against national liberation movements and socialism, and, ultimately, to attain world supremacy. Likewise, the DPRK denied the war crimes committed by the North Korean army in the course of the war. Nonetheless, in the 1951–52 period, the Workers' Party of Korea, WPK, privately admitted to the excesses of their earlier campaign against North Korean citizens who had collaborated with the enemy either actually or allegedly during the U.S. South Korean occupation of North Korea. Later, the WPK blamed every wartime atrocity upon the U.S. military, e.g. the Cencon Massacre, October 17–December 7, 1950, occurred during the retreat of the DPRK government from Hwanghae Province, in the southwest of North Korea. The campaign against collaborators was attributed to political and ideological manipulations by the U.S., about which the high-rank leader Pak Chung-ok said that the American enemy had started to use a new method, namely, it donned a leftist garb, which considerably influenced the inexperienced cadres of the party and government organs. In Soviet Aims in Korea and the Origins of the Korean War, 1945–1950, New Evidence from Russian Archives, 1993, by Catherine Weathersby, confirmed that the Korean War was launched by order of Kim Il-sung, 1912–1994, and also refuted the DPRK's allegations of biological warfare in the Korean War. The Korean Central News Agency dismissed the historical record of Soviet documents as sheer forgery. Holocaust Denial. Holocaust deniers usually reject the term Holocaust denier as an inaccurate description of their historical point of view, instead, preferring the term Holocaust revisionist. Nonetheless, scholars prefer Holocaust denier to differentiate deniers from legitimate historical revisionists, whose goal is to accurately analyze historical evidence with established methods. Historian Alan Berger reports that Holocaust deniers argue in support of a preconceived theory that the Holocaust either did not occur or was mostly a hoax by ignoring extensive historical evidence to the contrary. When the author David Irving lost his English libel case against Deborah Lipstadt and her publisher, Penguin Books, and thus was publicly discredited and identified as a Holocaust denier, the trial judge, Justice Charles Gray, concluded that Irving has, for his own ideological reasons, persistently and deliberately misrepresented and manipulated historical evidence, that, for the same reasons, he has portrayed Hitler in an unwarrantedly favorable light, principally in relation to his attitude towards, and responsibility for, the treatment of the Jews, that he is an active Holocaust denier, that he is anti-Semitic and racist, and that he associates with right-wing extremists who promote neo-Nazism. On February 20, 2006, Irving was found guilty, and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment for Holocaust denial, under Austria's 1947 law banning Nazi revivalism and criminalizing the public denial, belittling or justification of National Socialist crimes. Besides Austria, 11 other countries including Belgium, France, Germany, Lithuania, Poland, and Switzerland have criminalized Holocaust denial as punishable with imprisonment. In textbooks. Former Yugoslavia. Throughout the post-war era, though Tito denounced nationalist sentiments in historiography, those trends continued with Croat and Serbian academics at times accusing each other of misrepresenting each other's histories, especially in relation to the Croat-Nazi alliance. Communist historiography was challenged in the 1980s and a rehabilitation of Serbian nationalism by Serbian historians began. Historians and other members of the intelligentsia belonging to the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts, SANU, and the Writers' Association played a significant role in the explanation of the new historical narrative. The process of writing a new Serbian history paralleled alongside the emerging ethno-nationalist mobilization of Serbs with the objective of reorganizing the Yugoslavia.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.